which I thought was going to, well, the title was personally intriguing. So it was the effect of a plant-based low-fat diet versus an animal-based ketogenic diet on food intake, basically.
And ad libitum often means to me that the people eating the food are rats.
Yes, well, and there may be something in that. So we'll go. So you might go, why on earth are we talking about this? Well, obviously obesity keeps lots of us in jobs, and you know, the obesity strategy was the way to beat COVID and many other things, and also the aim of this was to compare they said a low carb versus low fat, but ultimately it is a high carb versus high fat diet. And I think that actually this the part of the way to think about this paper is, are you a high carb lover, the chomas of this world, or are you a high fat lover? And if you Google this, there's obviously a lot about it.
I think like Syra.
The Syra is a high protein, but we will go on to that later. It's going to be a major my major complaint about this is that, first of all, they did not consult Syra about it, which, but you know, that's often a problem. But actually, in a really practical sense, so the bottom here is the Game Changers. Now, I confess I have not watched this on Netflix, but one of my illustrious colleagues says to her diabetes patients that they should go on a plant-based vegan diet because of the evidence from this documentary. And on the other bottom corner is my cousin in the States, who is on a high-fat diet. And so she sent around a message going, I've smashed it. I've eaten 74% of my calories today have come from fat. Isn't that wonderful? And only 3% from carbs. And I thought, I don't think that neither of these feel good or right to me. And therefore, I quite like some evidence to back up my intrinsic ribbing of my cousin. And when I have to confront diabetes patients who are saying, well, I'm eating a lot of pasta because it's a plant-based vegan diet, that maybe things are wrong. So
just say Arnold Schwarzenegger has provided.
I mean, Jackie Chan, Lewis Hamilton, I think they've, you know, if they've got an illustrious supporting this. And Novak Djokovic, who is also known as obviously no vaccine Djokovic. So it's yes. Okay, so it purports to, so back to the science, it's looking at the two different theories behind obesity. So one is the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis, which is basically eat carb, more insulin, put on fat, or the fat hypothesis, which is eat fat, get fat, and mainly because fat has very little effect on your satiety. So you can, and it's very energy dense, so you can eat a lot of it. You have passive overconsumption, and therein lies the, you know, ad libitum fat rat, fat mouse scenario. So the aim was to look at is to distinguish which one of these two is more of a sort of a problem, was the kind of the basis of this. And so they got 20 people. Now, if you look at the list of authors, I do wonder if they just got the authors to take part. There are about 20 of them. But they got 20 people to take to come into a metabolic unit. So I guess pretty much the equivalent of the CRF here at Hammersmith. And they were randomized to 2 weeks of a low carb diet, followed straight away by 2 weeks of a low fat diet, or 2 weeks of a low fat diet, followed by 2 weeks of low carb diet. But I'd like you to think of this as actually 2 weeks of a high fat diet, followed by 2 weeks of a high carb diet, or 2 weeks high carb, followed by high fat. Because it's not that they were saying you're not going to eat very much and you're basically just going to eat salad. It was a purposeful, we're replacing one macronutrient with another macronutrient, okay?
Third arm, which was he's going to eat salad.
Yes, again, we could have had a third arm, just eat salad, fourth arm, which would be the bottled water and smoked salmon thyrohemide arm. So you know, this had a lot more potential than it did, but I think that which I'm kind of a big fan of cheese. So there you go. And actually, and if you look down at the bottom, this is let me go back. So this is the proportions in the diet. So the high fat diet was 75% of your calorie intake was supposed to come from fat, and compared to 75% from carbs.
And what's the same calorie intake in total?
So the diet, we'll talk about this. So they offered ad libitum food. So they were given 3 meals a day, told to eat until they were full, and unlimited snacks. But the composition of the diet was such that the people offered in the kind of the high fat diet, 75% of the food that they were offered, the 75% of the calorie content was from fat or carbohydrate. Now it's interesting because I don't quite know how they actually turn that into a diet. They talk a lot about the fact that it wasn't processed food. So I don't know whether you were literally given slabs of butter or just, or potatoes. I couldn't quite establish that, but this was the dietary mix that they were offered, was basically mainly fat or mainly carb. Okay. And then that's the sort of simplified version. And then what they did was basically put them, because they were on a metabolic ward, so they did bone composition using DEXA scans, so that can look at your fat or your fat-free mass. They did the green boxes are from the metabolic chamber, so that was a way of looking at resting metabolic rate. They did GTTs and mixed meal tests and got a lot of graphs basically. So I think it was a very nicely designed metabolic study, very cleanly designed metabolic study. And this is the sort of baseline. So it was, not quite 50-50 men and women in their 30s who were probably a little bit on the, they're all mildly obese, with a BMI of 27, so overweight, I should say. What should be said is that they were recruited. They were not told it was a study to look at weight loss or study to look at weight at all. So unlike many of our studies where, you're advertising, would you like to lose weight? Come to Imperial and we'll give you some drugs that might help you lose weight. They found 20 people who would just quite happily spend a month in a metabolic ward. I leave you to think about what that actually means, but there you go.
Yeah, it wasn't the authors though. I thought for a second you were, it wasn't the
No, I was being sarcastic about that, but I did wonder how you recruit 20, 30-year-olds to spend a month on a metabolic ward.
Yeah.
I mean, I presume that they were paying them quite a lot of money, but it's an interesting recruitment issue.
Yeah.
Because they're not medical students, because they're too old. So that was the other thing I'd wondered. This is the kind of the summary table of the important relevant results. I'll go through some more of them in a bit. We'll do in a moment. So everyone did both diets, one after the other. What's interesting is that the palatability and the motivation to eat was the same. So both diets were equally tasty or bland. So they were getting rid of is this a diet that you like more than the others? Okay.
Just go back.
Yeah. I was just going to go. I've sort of picked them apart in a little bit, so it's not just one big table. So obviously, probably the interesting one is actually, or the one that we want to focus on, is how much people are eating. Now, the high fat diet is energy dense, so you get more calories per gram of food. So part of what is interesting is that therefore your calorie intake is dependent not only on is volume dependent as well. And I thought that was quite interesting because obviously what you eat, there is part of it is stomach expansion satiety, as well as calories. I think that that's why you can eat a lot of chocolate, because it's very energy dense, very small, and it doesn't fill you up. And unsurprisingly, they found that people that are on the high carb diet, you eat sort of volume or mass wise quite a lot more. So they were eating about over 2 kilos of food a day, compared to 1.5 kilos of food a day on the high fat diet. But actually, because of the density of the food, the calorie intake was higher on the high fat diet.
Rebecca,
yeah.
On the previous slide, I think it looked like the high carb diet, you took longer to eat as well, eating rate lower. So
Yes.
I sort of thought that made sense to me, that you could eat a bowl of, I think it's right, a bowl of
Pasta,
ice cream
yeah.
quickly, but pasta takes longer to chew. But actually, so
Exactly, and they're probably eating more of it as well.
Is there an appendix of what was actually in the food? Or is it, you said pasta and cheese, but what is it?
No, I don't know. So they give you a long list of all the fiber and the sodium, but they don't tell you actually what was it, a steak, or was it a, you know, there's no, which is a pity, because it's kind of, I don't know what that meal looked like, or whether it was meal. They said it was not processed, so I don't think it could be meal replacements, which is obviously the easier way of the relatively easier way of dividing up diets. So I don't know. It's a really, I find it really interesting. I don't know how they physically gave people the food, what it looked like, but that's a question. And so we've got the people on the high carb diet, eating slower, eating a greater quantity mass wise, but actually about 600 calories per day less than people on the high fat diet. In the physical energy expenditure was the same on both groups, which is unsurprising. But interestingly, at the end of the 2 weeks, when they put people in the metabolic chambers, the high carb diet, they actually had a lower resting energy expenditure. So even though they're eating relatively less, and therefore their energy expenditure is relatively less. Or you could say that for the high fat diet, their calorie intake is a bit higher, but their energy expenditure is also a little bit higher. Okay. And it's pretty consistent across the days on the diet. And maybe there was something really not very pleasant on day 8, but who knows. What's also, I think, interesting is that there was a non-significant but slight weight loss for both groups over the 2 weeks of each diet. Remember, these are not people that are there for a diet study. So you're not really, you know, and they were told to just eat when they're hungry and eat till they're full. So this was not an active weight loss study, but it was trying to look at passive weight loss, really. Interestingly, is that the low carb, high fat diet, they appear to lose more, but when they looked at it, it was a greater, and the DEXA scans, it was a greater loss of fat-free mass. So it wasn't that they were losing fat. They think it was water content and bowel content, basically. Now, it's all very small, so I think that this is all really within the margin, you know, in practical terms, within the margin of error. You know, picking up a 1 kilo weight loss on a DEXA scan and being able to determine if that's fat mass or fat-free mass is quite tenuous. But there was a downtrend in weight. In terms of the blood, they obviously took blood for serum rhubarb, but the two that I think are of note and are of interest are obviously glucose and ketones. The point of the high fat, low carb diet is that you become ketotic with no glucose to burn up. You're burning up fat, so you are supposed to become frankly ketotic, and that's here in panel C. And they really do, on the low carb, high fat diet, very quickly become frankly ketotic. I think that the aim is that after above 0.5 is the sort of the cutoff, and which you're supposed to be really burning up fat. The flip side is that with the high carb diet, so the blue low fat high carb diet, glucose was significantly higher. Sorry. So you can see, so this is a picture after a glucose tolerance test, which I think is interesting that even at the end of having had the diet, those people on a high fat diet have much less of a glucose excursion than those on the high carb diet. And they were wearing CGMs for the whole time, and their overall interstitial glucose was significantly higher. It's a small amount, but you know, it was significant over the 2 weeks.
It is on the first day that the low-fat people actually are ketotic to start with. Just on the first day.
Yeah.
It's their
Yeah.
Isn't that weird?
Yeah. Don't know what. Yeah, it is really odd. Maybe it was affected by people having come from, because they had no washout period. So obviously.
Oh, I see.
Maybe that's slightly affected by the people coming off the high fat, low carb diet the week before, because they've then just because it was crossover amalgamated them. So those were, they did a lot of tests, but those I think were the sort of the key ones were the glucose and the ketones, and looking at the fact that there wasn't a significant amount of weight loss. So really, I was keeping this brief because I have clinic in 10 minutes, and I knew that would be short. So I want to say, what can we conclude from this paper? Well, I just thought this was, I have to say, I was a little bit disappointed in this, in that this was on Nature Medicine, and clearly it would have cost a lot of money to have 20 people in a metabolic ward for 4 weeks. But I'm not sure that it really takes us any further. I mean, it would suggest perhaps that people on a high carb diets are not ideal for people who have diabetes or pre-diabetes, because it increases their insulin, their interstitial glucose. And maybe if you're looking at the plant-based vegan diet as a treatment for diabetes, maybe you have to be very specific that doesn't mean a high carb diet, and you do just need to eat lettuce, and that maybe the low fat diet, so the high carb diet, they said had the authors concluded it had benefits for appetite control. I'm not sure that it does. I think that the high fat diet definitely doesn't improve your appetite. It doesn't affect satiety, but I don't think that you can say that those people having a high carb diet are not eating. I mean, they're still eating quite a lot, and they're not losing weight. So I think it's definitely a case that appetite regulation is far more complicated than just cutting out one macronutrient in a diet. And I think that in 2021, you know, this is something that we've known about for 20 years, and why people are spending time and effort and publishing very nicely arranged studies, but where you've basically said, well, we'll cut out a macronutrient, let people eat and see what happens. I'm not sure that there's a lot of merit in that. I think particularly, and I think this is where the Saira Hamid view of things comes in, is that actually also what we don't know a lot about is what happens if you're going for the high protein diet, which is probably as popular, if not more popular than certainly high carb or high fat, where we know that protein metabolism increases energy expenditure. It's through glucagon and through breaking proteinolysis, you actually increase your energy expenditure when you're breaking down protein, which is why protein high rich diets can cause weight loss. So focusing on the carbs and the fats, it seems a little bit antiquated to me. And that finally, these studies really need to integrate with behavior, because both of them were palatable, both of them were equally palatable. And actually the diets that will help people are the ones that they can stick to, but neither of these were particularly useful as diets. So there you go. That was my little summary of a paper that I thought was going to offer more than it did.
Well, it was in Nature Medicine, isn't it?
I know, I did it all the way through actually. I thought Nature Medicine, gosh.
They must have
Yeah.
spent lots of money getting people to stay in there for a month.
I know. But I'm slightly confused with Nature Medicine reviewers about, I mean, in terms of, not that it's not robust, but what does it tell us? I mean, it was hard. I'm not sure.
Did they measure gut hormones?
No.
I know that's
Oh, there's a
shame.
whole
That's
missing
real shame.
papers, yes. DIY, MPY.
Brilliant.
But I wondered if and it's not there in the hypothesis. I wondered if they had thought that they would get, they would have a more positive result for something, because it's a paper of real sort of negative results. And actually, and I'm a firm believer that we do need to publish the negative results, because
Agreed. I agree with you.
but I couldn't quite figure out what it was that they thought they might get as positive.
Do you think it's because of the ad libitum strategy they used, Rebecca?
Maybe.
Because we don't eat ad libitum as such, do we? We tend to eat 3 meals a day and then maybe snack a little bit. But
Yeah, what does
you're given food on your plate by and large, aren't you? Or you serve yourself and you eat to that.
You eat to what?
Unless you're one of my children.
So we don't know what they really meant by ad libitum.
I think that's what I mean.
And you've got no, in a metabolic unit is you've got no meal cues, because normally you can't eat all day because you're busy doing other stuff. Whereas I think if I was stuck in a metabolic unit, I'd eat all day because there's nothing else to do.
I think that's what I meant. Yes.
So yes, so you're quite right. Lost all your cues, haven't you? Like, okay, I'll do this amount of work and then I'll have something to eat or whatever.
Yes.
I mean, it's a bit
and
difficult.
constant access to food. I guess maybe. I mean, some people will have that in their lives, but others of us don't. And,
When was it published, Rebecca?
January.
Maybe it's been a lean COVID year for them.
And why do they include the plant-based diet in their title?
I know that's good.
I think what's interesting is I couldn't quite figure out what. Well, so that was their aim, was to look at. They said a plant-based, low-fat diet, but a diet that was therefore very full of carbs. It wasn't really a low. It was low fat, but it was replacing it with something else. It wasn't replacing it with, as I say, lots of spinach and broccoli. So I think that I wondered if it was because they wanted to, it sounded better saying plant versus animal, but maybe.
Hands up now. CA079. Is that Alex?
Yes.
Yeah, it's Jeremy.
I'm just Rebecca. I actually in January I get sort of comments from Nature, and they highlighted this paper in January in Nature, in the normal Nature publication, and referred through to it. And so I had a quick look at it. But I thought on the sort of ketogenic side, there was quite a lot of muscle loss as percentage of weight loss, and I thought that was quite interesting.
I think it's. I mean, they were. It was it was certainly said a fat-free, it said there was a reduction in the fat-free mass, but I think the commentary was all, they thought it might be as much water and gut content. So I didn't think it was, I didn't pick up that it was specifically muscle loss, but I could well be wrong on that.
Well, I'll look that out because my understanding of it, just when I read it, it just struck me how much muscle mass seemed to have been disposed of by going on a ketogenic diet. And I thought that actually was quite interesting because, of course, people aren't thinking that.
And possibly harmful.
And harmful, precisely.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that was just the one point that came out of it. But anyway, we'll have to look again. Thank you.
Yeah, I certainly think. I think that the loss of muscle mass is definitely an interesting. I'm going to just see if I can get this up.
Sean here. Is that not related to? Yeah, it could be.
What was the question, sorry?
I'll just read it out.
If it was muscle,
Buy it.
no, it's all right. Well, actually, I probably will lose my imperial access at some point, but at some point I'll get through.
Oh, what's that? What are you trying to rent or buy?
The article.
No, it's all right. It's just because it's on the desktop in the office. It's a bit slow rather than my laptop.
Okay.
But yes, I thought that there just could be something more from this paper.
Yeah, just write a letter and say that.
Yes, I was disappointed of Harlesden. I mean, they have done it as in typical dates. There are lots of very nice graphs.
Yeah.
There are lots of them.
Well, anyone can do a graph.
Yeah.
No, but there are, but I mean, it's not data. There's a lot of data.
Yeah.
No, but again, the data collection is the easy thing.
Yes, true.
If you've got
Yeah.
people with a metabolic unit who've done it for X number of days, what else is it doing with it?
Yeah. So they've certainly shown that it was a loss in the high fat diet, it was a loss of fat-free mass. But I'm not sure that, I don't think that they specifically pulled apart whether that was muscle or not.
Okay,
Yeah.
very helpful. Okay.
Very good. Any other thoughts?
Well, thank you, Rebecca.
That was very, yes, thank you for that.
It gave us
Yeah.
lots to think about.